In this video, I'll be demonstrating how I make my porcelain maker's marks, my stamps, which is my signature really, the tool used to impress my pots with the symbol that means they were made by my hands. And in this film I'll be showing you how I carve them, glaze them, and how I prepare them to be fired in my gas kiln. I don't use many tools for this job, mainly a sharp razor and a very fine potter's needle. The sharper and pointier the better. It's this I'll do a majority of the carving with, and you'll find that most conventional potter's needles are just a bit too thick, so alternatively you could use a sewing needle with a makeshift handle attached to one end. As for the clay itself, I prefer using porcelain as it's very strong, very smooth, and it shrinks a tremendous amount, which means you can carve your stamps a little bigger than necessary, then they'll shrink down and condense nicely. This particular body shrinks about 18% from the point you see it at now to the finished, fired objects. And I begin by flattening it out into a slab that's about 8mm thick. I then slowly dry it until it's about leather hard, and then I separate it into a number of lengths, each one about 5cm long, although really this part's entirely up to you. At this stage, I'm just making them slightly bigger than what I'll ultimately need. That way I can carve away material until they're exactly the size I want them. That way I'm not ending up with something that's too small to work with. And this is the rough blank I'll carve my mark into and refine. But first, I'll pierce a hole in one end so I can attach some cordage to it, which makes them easier to pull out from their case and more difficult to lose. I've seen some potters tie their stamps to a piece of cork. That way it floats if it falls into your wheel tray or into your reclaim bucket. You may have trouble piercing the hole if your porcelain is too soft, and it may cause the length to bend slightly, but any fault like that at this stage is really easily fixed, as you can just place the length onto the workbench and place something flat down on top of it. When it comes to actually carving these, the clay is more or less bone dry, so in theory you could make a ton of blanks, pierce them, and only use as many as you need, storing the others away for later use. Before I can move on, I'll give them another quick blast with the heat gun, just to make the lengths even firmer, as for the next stage I want them to be on the firm side of leather hard, just approaching bone dry. I then press them in between two bats, just to make sure they're flat, as force drying porcelain like this can cause it to bend. Just don't force them too much, as they'll crack so easily. Now, before I can begin carving, I need to make sure the surface that I'll be working is totally flat. And to do this I dip the head in water and then I rub it in circular motions against the tabletop, trying my best to keep it level and apply even pressure. I can then just tidy up the sides and now that one's ready to carve. This is also what I do if I make a mistake and need to start over, as by doing this I can just wear away a millimetre or two, erasing my ruinous attempt, which there's always a few of when carving such minuscule, intricate marks. Now, before I begin carving, I'll explain two things. The first is quite obvious, and that is when you're carving your mark, it needs to be reflected, as when it's stamped, the mark will transfer into the correct orientation. And as you can see, the small F on my maker's mark is backwards for that reason. The second thing is that when I'm carving my maker's mark, I'll do it in the centre of quite a large expanse of porcelain. For instance, I wouldn't carve a tiny rectangle like you can see on the right, and then try and carve my maker's mark. As this clay is relatively brittle at this stage, the porcelain would just chip, as there's really not very much material supporting it all the way around. So instead, what I do is I begin by carving my actual symbol, and then only at the very end, once I'm happy with it, will I carve away the excess porcelain around it. That way there's a lot less that can go wrong, although when you're carving at this scale, it's incredibly easy to make a mistake. And if you're creating a maker's mark, it needn't be as small as the ones I'm doing in this video. And so I begin by lightly sketching my F on the flat plane of porcelain, and I just dig the graphite in ever so slightly. I then take the needle's tip and begin scratching away the porcelain, layer by layer, bit by bit. This is a process where you definitely don't want to try and remove too much material at once, as that's generally what will cause things to chip, together with any harsh movements. I'm especially careful in the corners of the F, where the lines change direction, and at this point I'm simply focusing on form and depth of line, and I want the grooves to be about 1 millimetre deep. Throughout this process I blow away the excess dust so that I can see what I'm doing, and once the line is deep enough, I'll begin focusing the pressure of the needle on the sides of the grooves to make those nice and straight and sharp. I'll also use the very tip just to square off the ends of each line, pinching away the clay in the corners so they aren't so rounded. And once I feel like the mark is really well defined, I take a razor's edge and begin shaving away clay in a neat rectangle around the perimeter. And it's these edges which I want to remain really sharp and crisp. That way the mark leaves a beautiful impression in the clay. And I simply go round and round, removing the porcelain bit by bit, and again, never trying to remove too much with each cut. I'm under the impression, as a potter who makes handmade objects, that the stamp used to mark your own pots should also be handmade. It's your signature, after all, so I feel that to some degree it should come from your hand, instead of being a 3D printed piece of plastic or metal. A fine artist would never stamp their painting onto a canvas with a tool they had somebody else make, and I feel much the same way about how pots are signed. Once the rectangle is nice and neat, I'll then carve away much of the excess clay below it. I prefer leaving the handle portion relatively bulky, that way it's comfortable to hold and use, rather than being too dainty and small to even stamp into your pot. And with the stamp end finished, I'll spend a few moments just tidying up the handle, making the surface smooth. This way the glazes, which I'll be coating onto the ends of these, should settle a bit more evenly, but I'm not trying to make every single one of my stamps look identical. In fact, I quite like that they're each a bit different. They're small, sculptural objects in themselves, and I like the hand-carved look. And lastly, I'll test them once or twice at this stage, just to make sure that the transferred symbol is readable and crisp. I won't stamp it too many times, as at this point, the bone-dry porcelain is really incredibly fragile, so at this stage, as I store them and then bisque fire them, I'm really careful when I handle them and place them into the kiln. I made a few other stamps too, like this G that envelops an F, which was the first ever maker's mark I used, together with a collection of a few different Fs and a number of other symbols too. The next step in the process of finishing these is letting them dry out fully, which doesn't take long considering their size. They're then packed into my ROHDE KG-340 electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius overnight, and I position the stamps in such a way that the symbols themselves aren't coming into contact with anything else. This process of bisque firing hardens the clay, whilst also making the clay body porous, which is necessary for when applying the glazes, as water, which all the raw materials are mixed into, sort of acts as our transport material for the glaze, as the piece of bisque-fired clay absorbs the water and leaves a layer of all the glaze's raw materials on the outside. 2 days later, once the kiln has cooled down, the lid can be cracked and the pots unpacked, and they all fired with no issues, thankfully, although it's the second firing, which is much hotter, where things can potentially really go wrong. You can hear the difference in the material when I tap them together, as the clay has now partly vitrified. As for glazing these, that's the simple part. I simply dunked the end portion of them in a variety of test glazes that I liked. Last year I did a huge amount of glaze testing, and I've kept all the cups filled with their individual recipes, and I thought they might be useful for small projects like this, such as this rather amazing manganese glaze. I dip them in and swirl them around, just to make sure the hole fills up. I then hold them until they dry, and then place them onto a piece of foam, so that the glaze can't be damaged or chipped off, like it might be if I placed it down on a hard surface. Part of me thinks it would be quite an interesting project to take on commissions to make other people's maker's marks, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, where I make about 6 pieces and glaze them with a variety of glazes just like this, but I'm still toying with the idea. With all the pieces glazed, I now need to create the receptacle that they'll be placed in for the firing, and to do this, I simply roll out a ball of wadding, which is a clay-like material I mix from 50% kaolin and 50% coarse alumina hydrate. I roll it into a ball and then push a hole into it. I then place the maker's mark down into that cavity. I then gently press the surrounding wadding around it and then slice away the excess material. I have to make sure that none of the wadding is touching the glaze, as otherwise the 2 parts could stick, which might result in your maker's mark being ruined. I can then gently maneuver the wadding so the maker's mark is standing upright, and I can also press it down with an edge of a knife if I need to make the gap between the wadding and glaze greater. Wadding itself is a really highly refractory material, which doesn't melt whatsoever during the firing, and it should support the maker's marks easily. And it's the same material I use to prop up all the lids on all my store jars. That way I can fire them together, which saves space in the kiln and ensures they match. I don't push the maker's mark into the hole, rather it's just lightly placed into it. The idea being that the carved symbol just rests ever so lightly on the wadding. If I were to grasp the handle of the stamp and pull it out, it should slide out easily, rather than the wadding containing it and holding it down. You could also just fire these without any glaze, in which case they wouldn't need a stand whatsoever, and you can just lie the lengths of porcelain down beside all the other pots. I slice away angled walls on 4 sides, as using too much material would just be a waste, and it's quite difficult to reuse this mixture once it's been fired, although you could use the stands again if the stamp fit just right. Otherwise, if you have the equipment, you could grind the wadding material back down into a powder, and then add it back to still malleable, unfired wadding. I'll then take these stamps and pack them into my gas kiln, stacked into spaces that would otherwise go unused, which makes these excellent kiln fillers. And once my ROHDE KG-340 gas kiln has been packed, and all my porcelain maker's marks have been placed inside, I can call it a day, as tomorrow I'll come in very early to begin the firing. I ignite each of the 4 gas burners with the door open, and then tightly close the door. The firing lasts about 9 hours from beginning to end, and after about 4 hours, at 860 degrees Celsius, I place the kiln into a reduction atmosphere. This is done by greatly increasing the gas pressure whilst throttling how quickly the exhaust can escape. This causes the fuel inside to burn inefficiently, as there simply isn't enough oxygen, and thus the burning gas inside, which is seeking oxygen, ends up taking it from within the clay and glazes themselves, thus changing their colour and texture and opening up a world of possibilities that you can't quite achieve in the same way in an electric kiln, which is an oxidised firing. Once the internal temperature reaches 1290 degrees Celsius and cone 10 has fully bent over, it's time to end the firing. And now comes the riveting moment. 36 hours later, once the kiln has fully cooled down, the thick door is cracked open and the last of the hot air wafts out, and I get my first glimpse of my finished glass-covered pots and my porcelain stamps which I so carefully carved. They mostly all fired successfully, save for one stamp just to the right of the cones on the top that slumped over to one side, which is entirely my fault, as I carved the porcelain way too thin. All the others though look great, as do their glazed handles, although the real test will be seeing how well they transfer their mark. And it was quite eye-opening seeing these colours against all my other tones, and it made me think that maybe some of these glazes weren't so bad, especially on the porcelain, as they appear so vividly on that bright white clay. And to remove them from their wadding, I should just be able to pull them out, which worked in all of but 2 cases, which was the slumped mark and another red one, but thankfully none of my tiny Fs were damaged. And with the really stuck ones, I'll just grind away the wadding later, using a Dremel or a bench grinder. The last thing I do is just scratch away a few specks of wadding that were lodged in the grooves of the mark. And with that done, they're complete, and it's such a satisfying sensation to create tools yourself which you'll use on the pots you make. It's these that will forever mark a pot is being made by your hands, pushed into the clay and rocked from corner to corner so that it leaves a clear impression. You can make them whatever size you want, but I quite like mine being this little hidden notch which is quite hard to find and isn't a prominent feature on the pots I make. And so I'll end this video with just a few close-ups of my favourite stamps. This is the manganese glaze, with metallic crystals that shimmer and appear in a seemingly arbitrary fashion as they grow across the surface. You can also see just how much this length of clay twisted during the firing, as the sharp lines which I curved straight are now curved. This black glaze, when coated thickly, looks almost like solidified lava or elephant skin, which I don't particularly like, so I coated it on very thinly, and I adore the simple black surface it left. Then there's this simple red that shimmers and has tiny purple crystals growing in the surface. And lastly, this simple watery yellow. I don't know which is my favourite, so let me know what you think. And thank you so much for watching. And please do share with me any stamps you make yourself over on my Instagram.